instead of talking about Jordan Burnt Peterson's latest tweets, we're going to hit the archive. Kept these tweets for about 2 years now because I just had a hunch it would inform the discussion we're about to have with this rule. And they've just been sitting there in my little file folder just waiting for us to finally get to this point and for me to remember, which I did. The rule du jour is abandon ideology, which seems like a bit of a paradox to me. I don't know which though. Maybe Brussels? Like, wouldn't the dictate to abandon ideology be a bit of a ideology itself? Because it's essentially an idea system. So if we were to follow this rule, we would need to abandon this rule and just... Regardless, in October of 21, a rare event happened. The man who is, in my opinion, notoriously vague in his writing, especially when it comes to nailing down what he means, gave us a definition to work with. Quote, "If it's religion, you have to do something difficult. If it's ideology, someone else has to." This came a couple hours after another tweet where he said that higher ed needs to teach students wisdom, not ideology. And if you don't know the difference between the two, life hasn't been hard enough on you. Bless your heart. So from these tweets, we know where his boundaries between the good religion or wisdom box and the bad ideology box are. In his view, ideology tries to change other people's behavior, but religion doesn't. If you believe that, stick around after the video because I have an amazing real estate opportunity in the underserved bridge space for you. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! And because I have a feeling this video is going to be on the relatively longer side, I'm going to take the opportunity to roll the credits probably here now. As a reminder, if you sign up for my Patreon, you get access to scripts for all the videos, behind the scenes content when it exists, extended cuts when they exist, polls when I get back on top of that, because Recovered Memories is still in the works after all these years. When I get my health feet back under me, because we're going to go with this being a when, not an if, a when I get my health situation back under reasonable control, we'll start doing the live streams, the game nights, the just fun hangout stuff again, because I do miss it. It just... But there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Neurologist visit went well. There's more tests on order and more tests with the swallowing stuff, but, you know, stuff is happening at least. So hopefully we will get the hangouts and everything happening again. Also, it's not something that everybody's taken advantage of, but for the, I think, Mega Duck and up tier, I'll put it on the screen, you get a thank you card from me every month. Handwritten. Well, some of it's handwritten. I don't make the cards by hand yet. And it's been including stickers that you can see some of on the other camera angle better here. So if you would like a thank you note, you know, just sign up for those tiers. Also, let me know in the comments what your feelings are towards Patreon, because I'm getting tempted by other platforms. So if you would want to use a different platform, sound off in the comments, because I would love to know if, like, Fourth Wall would be an option. Thinking of adding the YouTube memberships with different stipulations, so sound off in the comments if those would work for you. Okay, that's enough rambling. Let's start this video. Welcome back to this cognitive psychologist trying her best to swim in the Nietzschean sea, despite not knowing how to philosophically swim.
Hello, how are you? I am under the water. Please help me.
Checking back in with the overture for what we can expect here, it rounds out this rule grouping and, quote, describes the danger of attributing the cause of complex individual and social problems to single variables such as sex, class, or power. Yep, buckle in, dear viewer. It's that time in the book again. Why is it Rule 6 where things take a sharp turn in these books? Granted, Rule 5 and 12 Rules was this parenting chapter, and there was some rough advice in there, but Rule 6 was where the gloves really came off. And it's also finally happened. Sometime in writing this, I broke the spine on the book, so whoops. This chapter art pivots away from the Western classical vibe into Soviet-ish propaganda, because of course he can't not talk about the Soviets in his life advice book. Why it's a babushka instead of what seems to have been more the norm for anti-kulak propaganda? let's consult his interview with the artist.
That's your version of a Soviet-era propaganda poster.
Yep.
Now, you must have seen many of those when you were in Riga.
No, I haven't seen any of those because I was born in 1977.
Oh. For reference, the dekulakization was over by the mid-30s. Latvia experienced massive trouble is an understatement. It was bad. Purges, deportments, Russification, and cultural genocide, to name a few. So yeah, she would have seen propaganda posters in Riga in her childhood. Just the chapter art focuses on priests and kulaks.
I wanted her to look mean, cruel, bitter, just like the women I saw in Riga in 1977. The women looked like that, Russian women.
Then they talk about the devastating consequences of the Soviet ideology for a bit, and then ideology in general. But we don't get any more insight into the choices made, which is weird because there were definitely choices happening. As an American only encountering these through cultural osmosis, it seems like there's generally a vibe to Soviet-era propaganda posters. It seems like they were very, yay, go team, and communism's awesome, in a non-confrontational way. And there's even apparently a term for this. Heroic realism. A couple instances of the poster subject pointing at the viewer in my quick search were from recruitment posters for World War II. So it makes sense they'd have a more familiar Uncle Sam wants you poster viewer feel to them. The meanness, cruelty, and bitterness seems to have been more present in the posters focused on outgroups, like the wealthy landowners or Americans. Which of course it was. This is propaganda, after all. Other the outgroup successfully enough, and you can build support for literal murder. So the chapter art, which is supposed to remind us of Soviet-era propaganda targeting and excluding, apparently, the priests and kulaks from the collective farms, is instead using tropes from war recruitment posters and features a woman angry because of her ideology, rather than the kind of more informative and interesting caricature of those outgroups. Maybe there isn't useful insight to be had. Rounding out the stuff to talk about up front are his references. He started the book with a larger number of references per chapter, and it's gradually dried up. We are back to the relative big time with 10 references. But, as you'll see, it's nothing to get too excited about. Curb that enthusiasm. Of the 10, we've only got 2 new Firm 12 Rules citation faces. These are a paper from Plus One looking at the life course dynamics of affluence and a Monty Python skit. The returning players are, of course, for this topic, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Panksepp, De Sola Price, Nietzsche, and Solzhenitsyn. In many cases, the same reference is being attached to the same point as from 12 Rules, only now with the commandment that we abandon ideology instead of straightening up our house. Although, that instruction does get folded in at the end. Spoilers. But as has frequently been the case, Peterson's referencing leaves much to be desired. He claims many things about Nietzsche thinking or believing stuff, but actual page numbers for those are mysteriously absent, which makes this cognitive psychologist's life that much more difficult because I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of Nietzsche. So, this video will see the triumphant return of my Discord's philosophy friends. Well, I don't know about you, but I think this intro's gone on long enough. So, let's do the quick refresher of the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from in a completely new order from what I normally do, keeping it fresh for ya. You have to subscribe for that if you haven't already, right? Right. So, this means I'm talking about his references some more. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, and this means I'm responding to the book or working in some reference discussion. No sense in putting it off further. Let's get to abandoning that pesky ideology. In exchange for some killer merch, you can be a pedantic hypebeast, which is the best kind of hypebeast to be, or a more restrained neater of citations, or haver of cute chaos dragons. Mugs, hoodies, shirts, stickers, I got you. And with that absurdicide out of the way, let's drop into the wrong places. The first section is mostly about what a success 12 Rules was and the subsequent tour, and people telling him how much of an impact his work has had on their lives. So it's a lot auto-congratulation to set up this point.
What is going on? Any sensible person would be taken aback, to put it mildly, by all of this. It seems that my work must be addressing something that is missing in many people's lives.
I guess. But if that's the yardstick we're using, then anybody who sells books or goes on tour is addressing something missing from people's lives. Which, if you settle into a certain philosophical mindset, is true for a lot of entertainment, I suppose. Why, yes, hello, good day. I would like to purchase a ticket for one anti-boredom measure. Ah, yes, a brief reprieve from the inevitability of death. Most excellent. That'll work, I guess. Yeah, it'll work. The thing he seems to not consider is how big the self-help industry is. If you lump the mental health stuff and career advice, weight loss tricks, just everything that falls under the self-help umbrella together, the industry revenue is in the billions. In my opinion, this is at least in part due to the self-help cycle some people can fall into. Because not everybody has a kitty on their lap. No. A person probably doesn't seek out these sorts of works because things are feeling absolutely great in their life. They may be seeking growth or change or happiness or, yes, Peterson, meaning. And people are talking about this book as providing that. So yeah, they can check it out. So they read it. They feel like maybe they got something important out of it and maybe try to implement those changes in their life. And for a bit, they might actually feel better about things. Because they're petting a kitty. But then, just like the cat, reality sets in. Assuming there was actually something useful in the book and it wasn't just fluff, the person may be falling back into old habits and things are starting to not feel so great again. Pessimistically, the cat's gone. Maybe there wasn't anything useful in that book after all, and whatever good thing they were feeling was just from a change in routine. In either case, they may be feeling that self-improvement itch again, and hey, people are talking about this other book that's seeming to help improve their lives, so let's check it out. Feel free to swap out book for online course or weekend retreat or whatever. Same gist. It's like a manifestation of capitalism. We need to bootstrap our well-being, and the way to do that is to buy something. It can't be that there are systemic factors in play making us feel bad.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
No. It is our responsibility to fix ourselves. However, we are too complex to be able to do it ourselves in our silly little brains. We need the help of wise thought leaders who can show us the way. And if we fail, it's because of our inadequacies, not the advice. The system's not broken. I am. And if you mix in the Rorschach writing style, where the reader's having to do a lot of lifting for what meaning is even coming from the text at all, you might have yourself a career path where it might not matter if you lose your clinical license. And mid-writing, I am gifted this by Dr. Peterson. He's apparently been getting to know Tony Robbins, a self-help god who's been helping selves for quite possibly as long as I've been alive. In his speaking events, he feels like the subject that gets the most rapt attention is responsibility, which he has an interesting take on.
You might even consider the inculcation of responsibility the fundamental purpose of society.
I suppose there's a nugget of truth there, but amusingly for what's coming later this chapter, it seems like he's having to abstract a lot down to make that point totally work. Like, yeah, through a certain lens, there is a lot of explicit and implicit responsibility in a functional society, but there's so much more to it. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. There's a face I make when I'm reading philosophy, and it goes something like, I think it's kind of like, ugh. And it's even good philosophy, not just the lobster stuff that we've been reading in this book. And working on this video just... Don't get me wrong, I enjoy philosophy as much as the next lefty YouTuber, but it may as well be a magic trick for me. I try to pay attention and absorb it and just stay with it, but at some point my brain will go into chickens on the moon mode.
What we are talking about here is what philosophers call subjectification, and it's famously very simple. To understand it, let's read a passage from philosopher Louis Althusser.
I'm honestly surprised it doesn't make an audible click when it happens. It's that much of a flip switching. And this chapter is practically all philosophy. From somebody who quite possibly wields it as well as I do, but without that awareness or understanding.
But something has gone wrong. We have committed an error, or a series of errors. We have spent too much time, for example, much of the last 50 years, clamoring about rights, and we are no longer asking enough of the young people we are socializing.
It would be insulting to ascribe this take to anything relating to his generation. This is a peak conservative take.
These damn kids are all hopped up on their civil liberties, can't take no personal responsibility these days. In my day, we were glad to have the overlord's boot on our neck, and we kissed it and licked it with love because we respected the hierarchy.
But wait, there's more.
We have been telling them for decades to demand what they are owed by society. We have been implying that the important meanings of their life will be given to them because of such demands, when we should have been doing the opposite. Letting them know that the meaning that sustains life in all its tragedy and disappointment is to be found in shouldering a noble burden. Because we have not been doing this, they have grown up looking in the wrong places. And this has left them vulnerable to easy answers and susceptible to the deadening force of resentment.
And then he asks what historical context set us up for this? As if there's any doubt what Dr. Horde's Soviet art is going to talk about. So I've been trying to think about it, and I feel like the implied source of meaning I was raised with was... I don't even know. We rarely went to church, so I missed the boat on that meaning source. We were a working class family, so finding meaning in life was basically secondary to staying financially afloat-ish. It was pretty much explicit in my house that I needed to lean into being good at school because that was eventually going to be my ticket into the middle class. And at some point, I would find meaning through my work, I guess. Digging around my memories some more, I suppose the whole girl power thing of the 90s could slot into the first part of this quote, that girls and women were strong and capable of things too. But I don't think there was this demanding what we're owed by society sense to it. I see it now. I see what he's doing. He's playing the entitled millennial card. That we youngsters, who are now starting to hit our 40s, think that we are entitled to job stability, affordable housing, not being killed by cops, livable planet, drinkable water, food. To spoil things for a future video, the wrong places are any of the social or environmental causes he doesn't like, which he thinks people are getting into because they weren't set on the straight and narrow conservative path of meaning by their parents or society. It couldn't be that people are pushing for social change because society could be better.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
The wrong places are all the isms, and given his two-box mode of thinking, it's not too hard to figure out where the right place to find meaning is. Oh look! The next section title is referencing God. Nietzsche time. We're going to be covering very similar ground to what we did in the original's Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, on top of Rule 6's set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. An interesting wrinkle appears when we compare the two books, though. The lead up to God being dead in 12 Rules was basically Christian apologetics. That Christianity put everyone, quote, equal before God, regardless of their station in life. Because, don't you know, Christianity, quote, separated church from state, Peterson claims, as he forcefully shoves divine right under the rug. Also, hey, Christianity viewed slavery as wrong, despite its, quote, immediate utility. He didn't specify how the transatlantic slave trade was allowed to happen if Christianity, the dominant religion of those trafficking and owning people, viewed it as wrong. Continuing on, he argued that after the solutions to divine power hierarchies, sex work, and feeding people to lions were figured out, Seriously, those were on his list of, quote, impossible problems. Only harder problems were left, which was what motivated the development of the scientific method. In the West, 4 certain definitions of science. This is now also the history corner. Hi. I would disagree with Peterson's characterization for the impetus for science. It was a whole series of people, the majority of whose names have been lost to history, and amenable environments that let empirical science, as we understand it today, develop. And yeah, the church did have its hand in some of that, but it wasn't all of it. So in all of that nonsense is where Peterson deploys the Nietzsche. He included more of the God is dead quote last time, instead of just the 3 words devoid of context everyone knows. But even then, the rest of what Nietzsche wrote helps establish the tone. I'll also point out that, in the context of the gay science, this appears in a sort of philosophical parable and is said by the madman to a very confused group of people in a marketplace because he had come too early and it hadn't yet been done. And it's an idea that Nietzsche played with a bit elsewhere. That he used a character to say this gives some separation between the author and the idea being conveyed. We'll be revisiting this when we're done comparing contexts. Peterson spent some time on the, quote, hammer-wielding philosophers' attacks on Christianity, that the average Christian didn't have much moral work to do, and that Christians hadn't been acting very Christ-like. Slipped in a little Dostoevsky for seasoning, then concluded that Dostoevsky transcended Nietzsche because Nietzsche was too angry and didn't see that the more modern, corrupt Christian faith, quote, still managed to make room for Christ, which is honoring the, quote, enduring wisdom of the West. But Peterson can forgive Nietzsche, because like his beloved Jung, Peterson said Nietzsche thought the suffocating unfreedom of Christianity was necessary for the, quote, emergence of the disciplined but free modern mind, which he naturally had to take to a weird Tyler Durden-esque space. Tell me this isn't a stuffier version of it's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything. Rounding out the Nietzsche portion, and most relevant for what we're talking about now, Peterson said that the death of God and Christian dogma left room for nihilism and, quote, totalizing utopian ideas, which then led to communism and fascism. There's also a little bit in this quote alluding to Nietzsche's original conception of the Übermensch, and us needing to, quote, invent our own values. Note how quickly he had to smack down that idea with some Jung and the innate knowledge of our souls. Can't have us inventing our own values. From here it's less relevant, because it goes into a style mad thing about thinking being like the resurrected Christ because you have to let ideas die, so we are taking the Nope Express out of there. So in summary, the quick version of the 12 Rules context is that God was pronounced dead in 1882 because the Western dogmas, so very, very important in unquestionably establishing the equality of everyone everywhere, lost credibility because Christianity had removed personal moral responsibility from Christians. The death of God left room for nihilism and idealistic utopianism to spread, which then led to the horrors of the last century. This time around the Nietzsche deity cemetery, there's a noticeable shift in Peterson's framing, which is weird because this chapter is on abandoning ideology, but we can't abandon one thing without replacing it with something else. And since religion is the other box implicitly to ideology for Peterson, it strikes me as odd to not go with the apologetics route again here. Peterson also acts like this pronouncement from Nietzsche just landed and that was it, no subsequent work built on it. It was just a nihilistic doom spiral from there on out. But existentialism, a very broad philosophical movement, and not to be confused with but existentialism, did wrestle with the now what left over after the metaphorical death of God. A favorite of the Philosophy Phriends that's come up earlier this series is Albert Camus, a key voice in absurdism. But yeah, there may not be any higher meaning or purpose in life, so make your own. Why not? With all that out of the way, let's talk some more about God being dead.
Nietzsche did not make this claim in a narcissistic or triumphant manner. The great thinker's opinions stem from his fear that all the Judeo-Christian values serving as the foundation of Western civilization had been made dangerously subject to casual, rational criticism, and that the most important axiom upon which they were predicated, the existence of a transcendent, all-powerful deity, had been fatally challenged. Nietzsche concluded from this that everything would soon fall apart in a manner catastrophic both psychologically and socially.
I put this section to my Discord's philosophy friends, and they live here in my monitor, apparently. Because I know philosophy is not my lane, but I also know enough to know that Peterson's summary sounded wrong. And yeah, wrong it is. Although Peterson may have stumbled into being slightly correct because Nietzsche used the term Jewish Christian back in the 1800s, where it had a different connotation and usage than the muddying and kind of problematic one it has today. To be able to say something more substantive and informed than the that you got when I did this in 12 Rules, I read parts of Nietzsche that were cited by Peterson while working through this video. Emphasis on parts. The Gay Science is roughly 400 pages, and The Will to Power is a tad over 600. That is a lot of reading to try to keep my philosophy-averse attention from yeeting itself out the window. Also, my relatively shallow reading will always pale in comparison to those who have put in the hours and hours required to actually understand this stuff. Such is the nature of, well, understanding. Yeah, Nietzsche wasn't narcissistic or triumphant in this writing, but he also wasn't afraid or, as we'll see shortly, despairing about this. As conveyed to me by Haley, the tone is, quote, mournful, because we killed belief in the thing that made the universe feel like it gave a shit about us. Without the belief in a supreme being having created a comfy little world for us to live on, nestled safe in the bosom of his creation, we're left with the reality that the universe we live in is indifferent to us. Nietzsche being a bit sad at this realization makes sense. It's like the existential version of figuring out Santa isn't real. I don't think Nietzsche framed this murder as a consequence of the, quote, foundation of Western civilization having been made subject to casual rational criticism, though. Nietzsche's framing made it sound more like an almost inevitable progression from developing an empirical science that didn't value virtue above all else. Peterson expands on his interpretation of Nietzsche's writings and mental states, so we'll move on.
It does not require a particularly careful reader to note that Nietzsche described God in the Gay Science as the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned, and modern human beings as the murderers of all murderers. These are not the sorts of descriptors you might expect from a triumphant rationalist celebrating the demise of superstition. It was instead a statement of absolute despair.
Right. Yeah, absolute despair. In a book called The Gay Science, which the translator noted was called such because Nietzsche wanted to convey that science could contain joy. Also, now having poked around the material myself some, I can refer you to the section after the death announcement, called Mystical Explanations. Quote in its entirety, mystical explanations are considered deep. The truth is that they are not even superficial. So, tell me again, Doctor of Clinical Psychology, how Nietzsche wasn't at least somewhat for the, quote, demise of superstition. Pearson next references The Will to Power to say, let the record show it was at this point in writing the script I noticed a glaring error in Peterson's references. He has The Gay Science as being originally published in 1880, somehow the same year as The Will to Power. The usual way I catch one of these lobster mistakes is in trying to find a cited work, searching up the author and year, then failing to find the article and tracking it down. But this is Nietzsche we're talking about. The hard part was finding a PDF of the specific translation Peterson was referencing, and even that wasn't hard. And let me tell you why this 1880 error is so glaring, particularly for the latter work. Nietzsche had an interesting life. His doctorate was honorary, he was a very young tenured professor, he renounced his Prussian citizenship so was basically stateless, he never married, and the bulk of his work wasn't really appreciated while he was cognitively still around. It only really started to gain traction around the time he experienced a severe mental breakdown and disconnection from reality, followed eventually by several strokes, paralysis, and ultimately his death about 10 years later. The Will to Power was posthumously published by his sister. It was a very, very rough attempt at organizing his unpublished notes into something she portrayed as his ultimate work. And, well, she was big into the whole German nationalist thing, and did her best to shape Nietzsche's anti-that writing into being supportive of the very stuff he was against. And for a bit, she succeeded. So Peterson managed to put down a publication year 20 years too early for a work published after the author's death in 1900. It's almost impressive, really. Peterson next attempts to reference the will to power as Nietzsche's prophecy for what would follow the death of traditional ritual, story, and belief. Peterson's basically talking about Nietzsche's nihilism here, that in the absence of a higher power, nothing has meaning and life is without purpose. Whee! However, keep this detail in mind as we continue. Nietzsche put forward that Christianity itself was designed to prevent nihilism in the faithful. Also, that there were passive and active forms of nihilism. Peterson seems to use the passive form more frequently, as it's a sort of will to nothingness, but the active nihilism was associated with a personal strength of character. Also, that he saw nihilism as a sort of transitional stage between people following the morals laid out for them by Christianity and developing their own ethics. Yeah, it's pathological to stay in nihilism, but it's not the prophesied outcome. Also cubed, Nietzsche included the possibility that some Christians may be better served by just staying in the faith and not thinking about it, that having the curtain peeled back on their belief system would actually do them more harm than good.
As the purpose of human life becomes uncertain outside the purposeful structure of monotheistic thought and the meaningful world it proposed, we should experience an existentially devastating rise in nihilism, Nietzsche believed. Alternatively, he suggested, people would turn to identification with rigid totalitarian ideology, the substitute of human ideas for the transcendent father of all creation, the doubt that undermines and the certainty that crushes. Nietzsche's prognostication for the two alternatives that would arise in the aftermath of the death of God.
I don't know where he's getting this identification with rigid totalitarian ideology bit from. I don't know where he's getting most of this from, but that phrasing in particular jumped out at me, so let's see if we can trace it down. As noted, nihilism arising after discarding the Christian worldview was in Nietzsche's writings, but I think Nietzsche would argue that the meaningful world and purposeful structure of monotheistic thought were false, a holy lie, not something we needed to despair the loss of. Peterson attaching, quote, Nietzsche believed to this only makes things worse. To say that writings, which may or may not have ever even been intended to see the light of day, then pass through rounds of heavy reinterpretation by different translators and then the current author can accurately reflect Nietzsche's belief is bafflingly dumb. Peterson, king of the two-box thinking method, shoehorns Nietzsche's predictions following the death of God into people falling into nihilism, or, quote, identification with rigid totalitarian ideology, which is the, quote, substitution of human ideas for the transcendent father of all creation. If Peterson didn't bring up the Übermensch on the following page, spoilers, sorry, I would swear that's what he's talking about here. That we are swapping out a divine belief and moral structure for one that we come up with on our own. Except there's kind of an assumption in Nietzsche's work that the divine belief system structure moral hierarchy is also man-made. So where the fuck did Peterson pull an unchanging dictatorial government-imposed system of ideas from? Please, dear viewer, if it's in The Will to Power or any of Nietzsche's other works, do let me know so I can issue a correction down the road. But I am not seeing it here. In a move that's seemingly as intuitive as breathing for him, Peterson shifts from Nietzsche to Dostoevsky, this time referencing The Possessed. The Possessed, aka demons, aka the devils, was written by Dostoevsky to explore the Russian nihilism of the time, the same curiosity Nietzsche wrote about. Dostoevsky also essentially put the blame for nihilism on the death of God, in the losing national roots and Eastern Orthodox tradition kind of sense. All of the imported isms were just things people were using to try and fill that subsequent void. Peterson doesn't specify what the ideals that eventually birthed revolutionary communism are as laid out by Dostoevsky, but we shouldn't let little things like not understanding what he means by that prevent us from continuing.
The appearance of these ideals was not a positive development in Dostoevsky's view. He could see that the adoption of a rigid, comprehensive utopian ideology, predicated on a few apparently self-evident axioms, presented a political and spiritual danger with the potential to far exceed in brutality all that had occurred in the religious, monarchical, or even pagan past.
And closes out the paragraph noting the, quote, incomprehensible level of prophetic capacity of these two authors, which shows how creatives can, quote, bring to light the future before the non-creatives can even see it. There's a bit of a survivorship or availability bias with that note. Yeah, these two authors wrote things that ended up lining up pretty well with subsequent events. How many authors didn't? Ideals, doctrine, whatever he happens to call it next. He's talking around what it is, but won't say what it actually is. It's a complaint I had earlier this book. We're getting a definition by exclusion. We know that this bad thing is not something to do with, quote, traditional ritual, story, or belief. That's not rooted in, quote, monotheistic thought. And now that I've got these words in front of me again, what Pearson's trying to say Nietzsche believed is astounding. Framing a damning view of Christianity as actually being supportive of it? Wow.
Nietzsche and Dostoevsky both foresaw that communism would appear dreadfully attractive, an apparently rational, coherent, and moral alternative to religion or nihilism, and that the consequences would be lethal.
And then he quotes a part of The Will to Power that shits on socialism. You will note, dear viewer, that this is a different version of Will to Power than he referenced before. At least he gave us page numbers this time. Checking for the start of this quote on page 102, and it's not there. I hunted down this exact version of The Will to Power, and it's not until the second page the quote actually starts. To put this quote in a little bit of context, it's towards the end of the chapter on European nihilism, after Nietzsche talked about how great men of the current era were because they weren't the soft romantics of the 18th century. How these great men wanted to be free from bourgeois and religious morality. That the modern man was actually closer to nature, because nature itself is immoral. The 19th century European is going full instinctual immoral beast mode, and, quote, is strong enough to endure this point of view alone. Nietzsche sees culture and civilization as being in conflict, because periods that are great for one come at the expense of the other, and that civilization tames people. But don't confound decadent instincts with humanity, or debauchery and a lack of restraint with the will to power. The civilizing forces need to be cast aside, because natural man good, contradictions and social idiosyncrasies bad. Taking a moment here to point out that these idiosyncrasies include things like honesty and love. What one ought to do is a secondary question to what one can do, because questions of power are natural. With that established, we can see where Nietzsche is coming from when talking about socialism. Since socialism is generally concerned with, to put it in the phrasing we just saw, going against nature and helping the less able members of the herd. From what we read, of course Nietzsche would be opposed to it. The Paris Commune he mentioned was a short-lived attempt at a socialist-ish government in Paris following the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. It was brutally shut down after a couple months. And if I'm not mistaken, Nietzsche was a Prussian medical orderly during that war, despite having renounced his citizenship. That commune influenced Marx and Engels, the latter calling it a dictatorship of the proletariat. Back to Nietzsche, he says that there are, quote, too many people of property for socialism to ever take root, and these property havers need to possess stuff to, quote, be someone. Nietzsche spins this up into wanting to have more, leading to growth.
That greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
And given his view on socialism, he takes that to mean it's anti-growth. And that's where Peterson's quote starts. That it would do the world good to run a few experiments showing how poorly socialism will function, no matter how many people die in the process. Following Jorpy Borp's quoted portion, if I'm reading things correctly, Nietzsche found some utility in socialism hanging around as it, quote, delays peace on earth and keeps democratic countries a little sharp against the socialist threat, which also helps save Europe from marasmus femininus, of feminine wasting, if you will. Us women's, always ruining perfectly good societies with our decadence. Seriously though, marasmus femininus is such an incel thing to say, which, given Nietzsche's track record with the ladies, kind of fits. I would be remiss if I didn't properly bookend the context for Peterson's quote. Dr. Nietzsche's prescription to fix modernity. Seeing real combat and compulsory military service, quote, national thick-headedness, meet setting your house in perfect order, bodies taking importance over everything else, and to stop praising people for doing their duty with military precision. The section after elaborates on the manly bodies of the fine men, those wild savages. Rawr. To get absolutely lost in the tall grass out here, I am curious why he switched translators. As noted by the scholarly community, there can be important subtleties in understanding Nietzsche coming from the way his writing is translated. Okay, so the Kaufman translation is basically the de facto English translation of Nietzsche. Those were published in the mid-20th century. The Ludovici translations were earlier, part of the first push of translating Nietzsche to English. Ooh, there's some telegraphs to be had. Strap in for this ride. Select bits from the Anthony Ludovici Wikipedia page, because understanding the translator can help us understand the translation. Seems like he was initially more into the art side of things, but transitioned to philosophy by way of Nietzsche. Around the same time, the UK Parliament's House of Lords' ability to fuck with the House of Commons was reduced, which coincided with a change in Ludovici's writing to being more political. For his World War I and MI6 service, he was given an Order of the British Empire, but immediately returned it because it was too easy to get. Didn't know you could pull a hipster move on British titles, but here we are. I don't know if this snippet's relevant, but I feel like it puts Ludovici in Peterson's general vibe house. He received years of lessons on the Alexander technique, a health technology that claims that fixing a person's posture will help fix a person's health problems. And you know it's bad when any US health insurance company looks at something that would essentially be free for them to roll out en masse and nopes out of covering it. As listed on the wiki, he, quote, took traditional conservative stances on social issues, like socialism, feminism, and multiculturalism, to name a few. Egalitarianism denied important biological differences coming from a person's race and sex, and the weak were coddled too much, and he wanted to stop racial mixing. Unsurprisingly, under his views, eugenics is on the list. After World War II, and having written positively about Hitler after meeting the guy, and having been critical of the Jewish contributions to English history, he became a bit of a footnote, who was dismissed from MI6 because of his ties to an anti-Semitic fascist group. I won't lie, it seems like we're weeks, maybe even days, away from similar messaging from the blue check crowd on Twitter. What's the saying? Time is a flat circle? Yeah. It's only fair for me to give the same attention to Kaufman. He was raised Lutheran, but converted to Judaism after not being able to buy in to the necessary tenets. He converted in 1932, which combined with having Jewish ancestry, put him at eventual and growing risk in his native Germany. So he emigrated to the US in 1939 and subsequently became critical of all established religions. He also did some military intelligence work, albeit during World War II. He spent time in the existential philosophy space, translated a bunch of Nietzsche while holding many disagreeing views to the original author, and there isn't a similar section on his views, so the closest I've got for you is a summary of his own life philosophy boiling down to 4 things: humble ambition, love, courage, and honesty. These 2 translators have wildly different vibes. Let's see what that means for how the quote Peterson crowd is translated between the 2 of them. The differences between the 2 versions on this quote seem to be stylistic or phrasing choices for the most part. I feel like the part about the cost of socialism experiments hits a little different, with the Ludovici version feeling a bit more harsh and, I don't know, flippant about the cost. The more meaningful difference between translations comes in the following chunk: Nietzsche's favorite obstacles or inhibitions and remedies of modernity. Ludovici's national thick-headedness becomes national bigotry. The parenthetical is close to the same, but there seems to be a vast difference between saying a nation should be thick-headed or bigoted. As discussed in one article, Nietzsche isn't exactly a blameless victim in having his works appropriated for fascist purposes. Which is interesting because both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky were not only warning about socialism, but what would grow into fascism in the 20th century. Basically, with what's essentially a power void left over from the church losing its hold over everything, what would the replacement be? Would the state try to step in and build a pseudo-religion for the masses? And as it turns out in some places, yeah, exactly that. Instead of giving it all up for God, dictators try to get their people to give it all up for their nation and them, basically. It's a good thing I'm wearing my pedantic pants because we have gone down one hell of a tangent to make some very specific arguments. I'm going to let Peterson kind of wrap up this thought before commenting further. Peterson walks back his point of communism bad to admit that Nietzsche wasn't warning about the relatively mild types of socialism seen in some parts of the West today, with its, quote, sometimes genuine emphasis on the improvement of working class life. Nietzsche was warning against the collectivism rolled out in Russia, China, and the like.
Whether we have truly learned the practical lesson, the demonstration of the absurdity of the doctrine as a consequence of Nietzsche's predicted vast expenditure of lives remains to be seen.
Peterson's propensity to play fast and loose with what precisely he's talking about at any given point is on full display here. We went from the big bad being not having Judeo-Christian values because God as a representation of Christian tradition in the West was dead, and Nietzsche predicted catastrophic collapse as a result, to Jorperson retrofitting Nietzsche's journal writings about the nihilism of the 19th century into something supporting Burnt Man's underlying argument about religious tradition good. Anything besides that is big bad. To dropping in a little Dostoevsky to clarify that the big bad is the, quote, rigid, comprehensive utopian ideology, whatever that actually entails. To the big bad being communism, which, to be pedantic, includes specific attempts like the Soviet or Chinese communisms, all the way to anything building off the writings of Marx, then quoted Nietzsche about socialism to beef up the weight of his point. Something, dear viewer, he had to walk back because the socialist umbrella is, unsurprisingly, pretty large, so includes anything from the not abject failures to authoritarian nightmares. I really want to emphasize this. This brief nuance is surprising as fuck because he'll largely talk about socialism as if it were exclusively what was seen in the USSR or is seen in China. The core problem here with what Peterson's doing, aside from leaving fascism out of the discussion altogether, which is a huge oversight, is that socialism and communism aren't totally interchangeable terms. For instance, socialism can be implemented in a democratic system. Communism can't be. They're incompatible. They have to replace each other. It's not going to fly. And with all of this, we haven't even gotten to the actual ideologies he's talking about abandoning in this chapter. The isms that can send him into an absolute tizzy. The real kicker will have to wait for the next video, because I have stared long enough into this Nietzschean abyss for this one. No joke, he pulls the, hey guys, do you know what political party in Germany had socialism in their name? But hey, it's okay you guys, we have it on good authority that the communists, specifically the Stalinists if we're going by the picture used, but he only says communists, were worse. Until next time, bye.